Have been waiting for the live feed, but we're thankful for your patience. We're in the book of Genesis, continuing our new quarter here as we start a new quarter here in our book with our quarterly commentary. And the first couple of lessons, of course, have started us as we, again, looking at the book of Genesis about Abram or Abraham. And then, of course, we know Joan last week did a great job as she talked about the birth of Isaac's children and the illustrations there about Jacob and Esau and their order of birth. And then, of course, we know that ended up the trickery that Jacob used in getting the birthright, and she talked to us about the importance of that birthright in the culture at that time and how it impacted. And our lesson today moves over to the 32nd chapter of Genesis, where we see the story that, just to be honest, I heard it, know about it, but it's definitely not something that I know that necessarily that I have looked at in a long, long time. I think it was one of the scriptures that Jimmy used to talk about from time to time over the years in the youth group about Jacob and the conflict that he experienced one night. But at any rate, it's a scripture that definitely I haven't studied or even read in a long, long time. But specifically, we're coming out of the 32nd chapter, verse 22 is where we start. But of course, before that, we know of the fact that Jacob was sort of a schemer, we just have to call it like it is. He sort of got the birthright left-handed, if you will, for a meal. Of course, he tricked his father into giving the blessing. You remember that story? That he was able to do that. And then, of course, after all of that, he and his brother just basically went to war. And Jacob ran. He left and went to live with his uncle Laban. And we know the story about Leah and Rachel, how he got a little bit tricked himself in that he agreed to work 7 years for Rachel to be his wife, and Laban sort of pulled one over on him, and he got Leah instead, and because Laban wanted his oldest daughter to marry first, and so of course Jacob worked another 7 years for marrying Rachel. So he ended up with both of those ladies, and again, because Jacob sort of did some things to Laban, again, he's a schemer, then he and Laban sort of fell out, and so he decides, whoops, maybe I better head back and try to make peace with my brother, because now I've fallen out with my uncle, my father-in-law. Things ain't looking good. But know that Jacob had been blessed during this time with oxen and cattle and sheep and children, 11 plus children. I think 11 sons. Is that right? I think I remember that right. But at any rate, he's heading back, and he sends a messenger out in front to tell Esau, I'm coming back. I'm sort of sorry for everything and all the trickery. And he gets word back that his brother is not necessarily all that glad to see him, or at least he's coming to meet him with an army of 400. So at least the indication is that probably he's not going to throw a party. We don't know Esau's heart. But at any rate, Jacob says, wait a minute, an army of 400... Jacob was very prosperous. If you read the scripture, he had been blessed by the Lord during this time. And again, the wives, the family he had developed, and he had an army of his own. He had servants and all kinds of things. But anyway, he was worried. And so he works and splits his company into two companies and sort of to separate in case Esau were to show up with the 400 before he was ready. And we get to the point here where he's separated the camps, and now Jacob has another idea. On verse 27, that night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And so he had already separated his groups and servants and everything over here and livestock and those kinds of things. But now he's decided to send his family over the river here to sort of protect them maybe a little bit more. And after he sent them across the stream, he went over with all of his possessions. Everything that he had, he took over. All the cattle and the sheep that were divided up into this company, he took them across the creek. And so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Of course, the commentary talks about the artistry that has been painted about this story, how different artists have used all kinds of illustrations. In fact, I think the picture in the front of our commentary reflects, you see Jacob in conflict with an angel-looking man here with wings. But we see that the scripture talks about the fact that after he had sent over his livestock and all of that, that he was alone and he wrestled him till daybreak. Now, all kinds of stories come to mind about this. We've heard all kinds of probably scripture, sermons and Bible studies about this as to what this man, is it an angel like's depicted in this drawing? Was it actually God in human form wrestling with Jacob? You know, and I don't know, but it does give an example, as the commentary points out, about the appearance or the manifestation of God to humankind in different forms. And we see that Jacob, they just get into a wrestling match. You can envision in your mind what that ended up looking like. All kinds of things might come to mind, but anyway, this figure, this man, this God, this angel, wherever you want to go with that, they basically struggled all night long. Funny story right quick, because we're about to run out of time. Went to Appalachian, and the 2 guys that lived next door to Mitchell and I, of course, Mitchell and I were completely lost up there, had no idea what we were doing there. But anyway, these 2 guys were from Lincolnton, North Carolina. And one of them was on the wrestling team at Appalachian. Well, Mitchell and I thought wrestling was Johnny Weaver, on TV. We didn't know what wrestling was. We came from Northmore. Anyway, we went to a wrestling match quickly because we did anything to get out of studying, and saw him, Danny Hester was his name, wrestle. And I decided those are the craziest people I'd ever met in my world. 3 minutes, just as hard as you could sweat and wrestle and do all this kinds of things about making weight and all this. It's just amazing. So Jacob wrestles all night long, and the man at the end says that the man saw that he could not overpower him, so he touched the socket of his hip, so that Jacob's hip went out of socket. And then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." And Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" Then he blessed him there. And so Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, yet my life was spared. And the sun rose as he passed, and he limped because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. We see here that the struggle that Jacob has with this man, this human form, that they fought all night long. symbolic of the struggle that Jacob was already having all around him. It seemed like it followed him because of his scheming nature with his brother, with his father, with his uncle. It just followed him in Scripture as we see Jacob. But we see the man ask him, "What is your name?" Jacob, he answered, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel." The new name reflects the struggle in Jacob's life, and also the EL at the end. There's a good commentary point here on page 29 in my book that talks about that syllable found in the Hebrew name and how it's used throughout the Scripture, such as Bethel and the Ishmael, and the meaning of the fact that it has to do with a relationship to God in different forms, and how now Israel would be Jacob's name from henceforth, and how it was based on the struggle that he had to come to this point. And we'll see as we move forward in the Scripture that truly this experience was life-changing for Jacob, now Israel, and the impact that it had, because he has another son, Benjamin, later on, and we see the 12 tribes forming here in this man's life, and how the struggles that he met God that evening and struggled over it. And the illustration comes to me that sometimes we have to struggle. Sometimes we have to struggle with God to come to understanding. And maybe some of us are struggling around some of the decisions that we've been talking about here, but we know that God, as the commentary says, that God is always present. We only need to open our eyes, that God is present. Thank you, folks, for the discussion. Good lesson. Read that chapter in Genesis. See that Israel is coming.